Do you want to learn the tricks that top leaders use to get the most out of themselves and their teams? Well, Naftali Hoff is here to help. Lead to succeed. Picks the brains of top leaders to learn about their challenges, insights, and best practices. Here's Naftali.
Hello, Lead to Succeed Nation. It's Naftali Hoff, and welcome to Lead to Succeed, episode 137. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Sheldon Gilbert. Sheldon founded Kura Labs to create new pathways for ensuring employment in the tech economy for people from underserved communities. Kura Labs is a nonprofit vocational academy that offers free training and job placement in the high-demand sectors of DevOps, SRE, cloud infrastructure computing, and cybersecurity at Fortune 1000 employer partners. Sheldon is also the founder and CEO of Proclivity Systems. Proclivity builds and operates electronic marketplaces for secure trading of digital assets in real time, such as data and media. Beginning first in e-commerce, Proclivity has since developed the largest electronic ad marketplace in the pharmaceutical industry and extended his expertise in autonomous trading systems and secure computation in other industries. Sheldon, so glad to have you on the show today.
Thank you so much, Natalie, for having me.
It's my pleasure, and I'm glad I got through that bio. First of all, super impressive. Second
Thanks.
of all, totally out of my element. So
I hope
I didn't butcher that one too bad, but I know we're going to unpack it a little bit. So let's actually go right there. Tell us a little bit more about yourself. Tell us about your story. How did you get to where you are today?
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for having me. How I got here is rather circuitous. I had no idea. If you told me years later I'd be doing what I'm doing, I'd be completely in shock and potentially in distress. But, as a kid, I was born and raised in St. Lucia in the Caribbean. I came to the United States when I was 6 years old. As a child, my idols growing up were Jane Goodall and Dian Fossey. Naftali, I actually dreamt of being a zoologist and a naturalist. But if you're a child of immigrant, parents are like, no, it's doctor, lawyer, engineer, right? So you're kind of told what you got to do. But I was always interested as a kid in science and in all sorts of aspects of that and learning a great deal. And I'd read encyclopedias as a kid. It was always quite curious. I was fortunate to get to this program called Prep for Prep, where they actually identified, kids who were academically inclined in public schools. And we were identified at a young age, and I received a scholarship to then go to Horace Mann. And from thereafter, I went to Yale. So that's important, by the way. I bring it up because that actually informed why I created Kura Labs. That was a sort of a catalytic platform that basically changed the trajectory of my life. And I'm always forever grateful for that program and the downstream opportunities. But when I graduated from 1997, which is some time ago, dating myself here a little bit, there were two things I say that were seminal that occurred during that time. 1997 was the emergence of the internet. And secondly, was also the human genome was being mapped. So undergrad, I was studying molecular biochemistry, biophysics. And so, considering going into doing research, which I did, but back then, Naftali, listen, if you could spell HTML, you had money thrown at you. And so some friends from school, from Yale, they actually started a .com. I traded in my lab code. I was doing early genetic research, early areas around bioinformatics, a lot of gene sequencing. And I knew that was eventually going to be automated. So I left the lab. I went to Silicon Valley. I couch surfed for a year, fell in love with this whole new world, and I never looked back. And so from there, I then, years later, raised venture capital to start my own company, Proclivity. And then the premise for Kura Labs was really born out of challenges that we had at Proclivity. So launched Proclivity, and then I'd say about 5 or 6 years in, we actually had to migrate. We learned about this thing called AWS, Amazon Web Services, and this whole thing called cloud computing. We had no idea what that was, but shorthand basically is instead of actually having to buy all these very expensive servers and using a data center, we could basically rent Naftali. It's like what Uber has done for transportation. Instead of having to buy or rent a car, you can only pay. You can now just pull out your credit card and pay for a ride from point A to point B in real time when you want it. It's like in-demand transportation. It's not unlike what's happening with cloud computing. It's in-demand computing. So this is a game changer. So good news is we actually migrated onto the cloud. The bad news is we got our teeth kicked in. We couldn't find any cloud engineers. And again, as the story goes, if you could spell AWS, we would kidnap you, bring you back to the Batcave. We paid you to learn how to use those systems. So that really became the premise for Kura Labs, because I realized that there was we weren't alone in this challenge in Naftali Proclivity. There was a massive workforce imbalance. There's far more demand than there was supply of these engineers. And in particular, I want to focus in addressing this imbalance by also creating income equality, greater economic mobility by focusing on providing this to people from underserved communities. And that's sort of like harkening back to how Prep for Prep changed my life. I basically want to create the vocational academy for the 21st century economy.
Wow. Wow. There's a lot to unpack there. All right. Well, that was powerful, and I would love to unpack it. The workplace imbalance piece, I think, is really important. And then, of course, the underserved communities is almost like a cherry on the top, so to speak, because I think you're kind of solving two problems in one there potentially with what you're doing. Number one, you're creating more of a prepared workforce in an
Correct.
area which desperately needs it. It's kind of funny because my background is in education, and so I still do a lot of work in schools, though my coaching expanded well beyond, but I see it in education in particular. I see it elsewhere as well. This continuous demand, almost like what's the word I'm looking for? Almost like a clarion call for more people, more quality people. You know, a lot of folks, especially after COVID, really didn't want to go into or stay in the field of education. And so you've got schools, both independent, which is where I work, or public schools that are just desperate for quality people who can come in and inspire children and manage a classroom and all those kinds of things. And I think that's true in a number of different industries. And so you come in and you see a problem. See, I guess the part I'd like to talk about before so much the imbalance piece is the issue of identifying a problem. And instead of just throwing your hands up in the air or blaming the federal government or whomever, which is common practice for a lot of people, anytime they have a problem, you decided to do something about it. You decided to provide a platform where people could actually, get up to speed and become, useful, not only for your company, but for other companies out there as well. And you created a nonprofit to boot. So I'm curious to know, what was the thought process there? Why did you feel it was important enough that you're going to sort of roll up your own sleeves and get dirty making this happen? And what has been the result for you so far?
Yeah, a lot of really good questions there. I would say that it was interesting. I think that, and I don't know why this sort of came to me, but when I was 21 years old, I remember when I left the lab, I was really thinking about my parents really wanted me to be a doctor. I wasn't interested in becoming a doctor. And so as much of the disappointment of my parents, but I knew I always loved natural sciences and I really loved genomics, but I was interested in this whole new tech sector. And I sort of thought back after my third, Naftali, rather, like, what do I really want for myself? Like, what is it that I really want? Do I want a job? Do I want a career? Like, what is, and I actually thought about this. I don't know why at age 21, I thought about it. I said, what I want is a state of mind. That's really what I'm after, a particular state of mind. And the state of mind, I thought to myself, is one that involves continuous learning, continuous teaching, philanthropy, and traveling, and solving complex problems. And I thought to myself, I barely have any money. So what does philanthropy look like? Well, there's another aspect, giving of your time. And I always loved teaching. My father used to be a teacher in St. Lucia, so I grew up in a household where education was always underscored and emphasized, and I loved teaching. And so I started volunteering. I live here in Harlem. I started volunteering Saturdays, teaching math and science classes for students here in Harlem for the college enrichment program. And I spent time studying, traveling to Italy and teaching different courses and so forth. So I knew then that I was able to make contributions even without capital, because philanthropy takes on different modalities. And so I could do so with my time. So that was always there. And so the other major force that was occurring was realizing once I started Proclivity, an interesting thing start to happen, Naftali. I realized that we were trying to hire all these engineers, just in general, just forget cloud engineers, just software engineers. And I would see everyone coming from all these fancy schools, the schools I went to, and I realized that their academic training was woefully inadequate for the industry, for the real world. I mean, I don't care if you had a PhD from Carnegie Mellon or MIT or Stanford. It was woefully inadequate for what was actually required in the real world, which is developing industrial grade software applications that can scale, that are highly secure. Why? Because you've never been availed to those circumstances before. It's not unlike going to Juilliard and never having played the piano, but you've been studying music theory for all these years, or going to become a surgeon, a cardiothoracic surgeon, and just reading tomes and tomes of textbooks, never actually having done surgery. There's a big emphasis on reading and going to lectures, but actually not doing the functional work. And that's effectively what academia has become. It's become disconnected from industry, not through any fault of their own. By the way, industry has not been investing back in academia. That's number one. The cost has become intractable now. The cost of the degree has vastly outpaced the economic utility of the degree. People have been loaded with intractable debt. So getting a job working at Starbucks or Instacart is not ever going to pay back those predatory terms on their loans and those interest rates. So we all know that it's a model that is quickly requires extensive recalibration. On the other side of that, you actually have extraordinary demand for these jobs. And so the pipelines that traditionally would come from academia don't exist. The only ones that could address this is industry itself. And that's the reason why I decided, I had a bunch of friends who were running a couple of these academies, and I looked and I said, I know why no one's really hiring for those programs, because they're giving their students exposure, not functional work experience. And number two, none of them actually came from industry. They have never written a single line of code. They've never worked in these jobs before. I've interviewed hundreds and hundreds of engineers. I've hired, managed, sometimes having to grow, nurture, transition out engineers. I come from industry. So I decided to reverse engineer the entire curriculum predicated on two questions. Every job in the world is centered around two questions, by and large, I think. Depending on whatever the job is. You want to be a pilot, you want to be a sous chef, you want to be a veterinarian, you want to be a cloud engineer. Questions go something along the lines like this. Do you know how to use this particular tool? Insert whatever tool you want to. Excel, this particular oven, Terraform for cloud infrastructure, whatever the tool may be. Do you know how to use this tool? Great. Most people can answer that question, particularly if you're on YouTube these days and you're pretty curious, you can answer that question. The second question is the most consequential question, and this is where the music stops, which is, that's fantastic. You mentioned you know how to use Excel. Can you tell me about 7 or 8 particular models that you've actually built for various, in the auto industry as well as the telecom industry, building cash flow models, balance sheets, and discounted cash flows? And that's where the music stops, because unless you've actually had the experience working in the industry, you can't answer that question. So it becomes sort of this vicious loop where people can't answer that constant. And so where are they getting that exposure? Where are they getting that functional training? This is what employers care about. Beyond if you have certificates, which basically is people don't pay attention to, or what degree that you have, is your ability to actually apply those tools to solve their problems. And so what we focus a lot more is less about if you have a college degree, if you've ever gone to college, if you've taken it. Most of our students have no tech background whatsoever. What we look for are systems thinkers. What does that mean? I tell people all the time, look, if you've ever worked in a grocery store or you work at a restaurant, you may not know the terminology, Naftali. You may not know, right? You might not know the rubric and the terminology, but chances are if you worked in a restaurant and you've actually had to manage the cash register at some point, or had to take people's orders and bring it back to the kitchen, you don't realize it, but you're the API between the clients and the kitchen's the database, and the hostess is the load balancer. You don't know what those terms are, but you understand these constructs. You understand about systems dependency. You know that how to manage the inventory management system. If it's going to rain and you have a lot of poultry or fish that you ordered for the restaurant, it's probably going to go bad. What's going to happen if the sort of discount, these different things? You understand the influx, the inbound and outbound data and system dependencies. If you could understand, if you worked in those systems, we can train you on the technical systems. And so what I say all the time is like, look, and you're a teacher, you know this. There's certain things that we cannot teach by this stage. We cannot teach you to be relentless, have insatiable curiosity. We can't teach you to be resourceful. We can't teach you to have a high work ethic. We recruit for those things. We can nurture those things. Everything else we could teach. We could teach you Python. We could teach you Bash. We could teach you Docker. We could teach you Kubernetes. Those things but those other intangibles are, and I think those are equally distributed across society. Going back to the point about underserved communities. In fact, that is in abundance at many underserved communities where you are being forced to be highly resourceful to survive, to be insatiably curious, to survive, to have a high work ethic, to survive. But people don't typically look to those things because we have a lot of these constructs, which is, did you go to a particular school or do you have a particular degree? That doesn't matter in certain jobs.
Okay, well, you gave me maybe even too much to think about there. So I got to unpack it a little bit, just so we're fully clear. I just want to make sure our terminology is consistent here. So I imagine underserved communities oftentimes along either certain racial or socioeconomic or other criteria, let's say.
Yeah.
Is that how you're defining it?
Absolutely. In fact, oftentimes there's tends to be a high correlation between both, but our lens here primarily is socioeconomic, which unfortunately oftentimes means that people of color typically over-index in those things. But our view here, the program is entirely remote. So that means that we're dealing with various urban centers, but also the notion we want to go to Appalachia, the Mississippi Delta, Native American reservations as well, and communities. It's all there. Yeah.
Cool. So just out of curiosity, before we unpack what you actually talked about, I definitely want to discuss more pertaining to the interview process, the criteria that you look for in people, because I think that's oftentimes overlooked. I think a lot of people struggle, both in terms of job seekers as well as potential employers, as far as what do I need to present, what are people really looking for, and simultaneously, what should I be looking for in a potential candidate, both as an employer or maybe somebody you want to onboard for your program. But just to understand a little bit more, is the issue of being underserved for the most part, let's just say, a lack of access to technology, meaning to say, like, I come from a struggling school in, let's say, New York City or somewhere else. We didn't have the same kind of computer instruction. We didn't have the same kinds of resources at home where everybody has a device, that kind of thing. And that's what makes them underserviced or underserved? Or is there some other, for the most part, area that you would say makes them qualify for this demographic?
It's just a really good question. There are a few things that come to mind. The first is that this notion that people don't realize they have devices, they realize that everyone's not walking around with a supercomputer in their pocket. So that's sort of been leveled to a certain degree. I think there are some other components here that are really play. These jobs, the vast majority of people aren't even aware that they exist. If you ask the average person, like, how would you define cloud computing? They think about, well, on my iPhone or Google, I could actually put photos in the cloud. Is that what it is? But beyond that, they don't actually know that these jobs, cybersecurity, Terraform engineer, all the data engineer, DevOps engineer, data ops engineer, AI prompt engineer, they don't even know that these jobs even exist. That's the first thing. It's about availing them to these 21st century jobs, or the jobs that do exist. They don't even know how those will change in the decades to come. If you want to be a surgeon, you have to become versed in robotic surgery, or the fact that if you want to be a surgical assistant, you also need to become versed in those systems too. If you want to be a nurse or nurse practitioner, same thing. Those jobs are radically undergoing changes, particularly with the rise of AI. So the first thing is not even aware. No one's mapping for them what these career opportunities even look like. That's the first thing. The second thing is, because that's a seed of inspiration. The second thing is, what I would say is that one of the things when you're dealing with limited resources and scarcity is that there's no space for tinkering. Their kids, when I grew up, they talk about taking apart the computer. I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, child services would be called, like, I'm not taking away taking apart the VCR at home. If I did, I'm going to be grounded. There's no notion of taking apart the toaster oven and this and putting it back together. I would say that if you grew up with means, there is a spare VCR, there is a spare Walkman, there is a spare laptop or desktop in the home to play around with. In many underserved communities, there is not. So this whole notion, this landscape of tinkering, it's not permitted, right? There's no space for it, which is vital, by the way, I would say. And so the other aspect I would say too is that how does one even get exposed to these sort of jobs? Unfortunately, it's inside baseball. Okay, you're never going to cold call your way or submit your resume to get a job at Tesla or NASDAQ or Nike, all right, to work in their technology teams. This is people who will, if you've gone to the school that they've gone to, it's not unlike most of these high school jobs, whether it's investment banking or management consulting, it is through these self-reinforcing networks. So unless you go into a certain school or you went to a certain academy or a certain program, you're not even on the radar. And so those are the limits. So, and that's really driven by social networks more than anything else. So that's where the level of exposure that's actually given there. So those are the steps that we see.
So let me go back then to the to the interviewing piece for a moment, because like I said before, I think a lot of folks really struggle to figure out, who am I looking for? Oftentimes you'll have a great resume, but it doesn't translate. And at the same time, like you mentioned before, Sheldon, there are a lot of people who come out of the most prestigious schools and they seem to have everything that they need, and yet simultaneously they're not practically ready to do what you need to get done. I know you talked about the models and things of that nature, but from what's the word I'm looking for? As I'm thinking about it in particular, yes, you're looking for certain, let's call it training, but you're also looking for particular intangibles. You talked about system thinker. What is it really from your perspective? And I'd like you to think a little bit more broadly even than the kinds of people you would want to hire for your own purposes, that leaders should be thinking about today, for first and foremost, right? You're sitting with somebody, you want to ask them obviously some industry specific questions, get a sense of what they know, what they're able to do. But if you're thinking long term, what else do you want people to possess? I know you mentioned curiosity. I'm assuming industriousness, but I want to hear a little bit more about that in particular, because I think that'll help us broaden the benefit, so to speak, of this conversation to other areas as well.
Yeah, it's a very good question, because I think, look, what we're talking about here, I think is in fact industry agnostic. It doesn't matter what the job may be. The answer to that question actually ties back to another thing that you asked about before, like what are the sort of the stultifying aspects about being underserved? And I think one of them too, which I forgot to mention, which I think it plays into and answers this question, is the sort of the degrees of freedom that you have to do critical thinking and to start questioning things. I'll give you a perfect example. We do a lot of mock tech interview training as part of our program. And I'll never forget that one of our students said, well, let me get this straight, Sheldon, we're allowed to ask questions during the interviews. I said, not only are you allowed to ask questions, if you don't ask questions, you actually will not get a job. And she was just completely blown away by it. And then it sort of occurred to me, like, she's like, you have to understand, where I went to school, if you were asking questions, you're seen as either not paying attention, you're challenging authority, you're being recalcitrant, right? Or you're disruptive. And there's a whole level of pejoratives around that. And that's one of the this sort of inversion that we have to do, this sort of rewiring that we have to do. Like, no. You have to understand, in these jobs, particularly in the knowledge economy, or just in general, for anyone in any position, I don't care if you're hiring someone to be a pilot or a nurse aide or whatever, what we ideally are looking for is someone that can think critically when issues arise. My patient's pulse increased by a factor of 20%. What do I do in that situation? I know you mentioned that they are allergic to nuts. So what they're undergoing anaphylactic shock. What do I do? We're looking for people who could sort of think 2 or 3 steps ahead in a critical manner. That's what we're all, and so the interesting thing, particularly as a leader, is that you're actually looking for people that are going to ask questions of you, and also that are going to ask questions of the existing frameworks that we have, the existing processes. I welcome when someone's saying, it's interesting. So there's 7 steps in this process that you mentioned here. Why are we doing step number 6? Now, some people are going to look at it as that you're challenging authority. I'm going to say, that's interesting. Tell me more. Why do you think are you saying that we should remove step 6? Or are you saying that we need to, step 6 is really 3 sub-steps that we need to think about it, or we have to refact, like, what is it? That's actually who I'm looking to hire. Because the reality is that's effectively what we want. We want someone who is going to be looking at systems and reevaluate them and say, this could be more efficient, or we could lower the cost here, or we could be serving more people here. And those tend to be the most successful people in companies, the one who are going to come and said, I know we've been thinking about it this way, but I was thinking that we might want to try this.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That, and so that is what, we really focus on, and we try and extract that. Excuse me, on one side.
Okay, so I really do need to move on to the next segment, but I feel like there's something that you shared before that I can't let go, and I'm going to take 2 different things and combine them together, and maybe you can help us, because what I'm noticing here, first of all, you're very well spoken. Most people that I speak with are also well spoken, but there's a certain familiarity, both in terms of the linguistics, the language, the terminology, the ability to express yourself in a way that I feel is not common, especially for somebody who was not born here in the United States and who was an child of immigrants, etc. You also talked about another thing that impressed me a lot, which was this idea of having a state of mind. I think you said at the age of 21, which sounded to be mature beyond your years, because I think that this whole idea of who I really want to be, we might think in terms of, okay, I need a more sophisticated version than policemen or firemen or that kind of thing. But when I'm 21 and I'm trying to figure out my career, but this idea of marrying not only my future form of employment or future form of revenue generation with purpose and with lifestyle and some of the other things that you detailed over there seemed to me beyond what your average 21-year-old might be thinking about, and certainly at a level of maturity that I think is atypical. So just out of curiosity, is that something that you would attribute, let's say, to your parents and your upbringing? Is that something that was unique to your educational experience, or was there some other X factor? Because at the end of the day, what I often find, especially in today's world, is that people who can express themselves, who can think clearly, who are purpose-driven, who have the communication skills to articulate exactly what it is that makes them special, these are people who stand out from everybody else, who's maybe more pedestrian or mediocre or just average. And we're looking, of course, for above that. Talk me through that piece of your development a little bit, please.
Yes. I would say the answer is D, all the above. I think my father would argue about my level of maturity when I was 21, but at least I felt I was really mature.
Well, you're your revisionist history. You're making yourself more mature
exactly.
as you go backwards. But even so.
Yeah. No, what I would say is that undoubtedly being an immigrant and sort of navigating that milieu of being an immigrant had a tremendous impact on how I was wired as a child, because I would argue that I was born and I came into the world as an entrepreneur. The definition of being an entrepreneur is one who's actually trying to express something new and entirely creative given limited resources. Last I checked, that's exactly what a lot of immigrants are doing. And by the way, immigrants are by definition to be self-selecting. These are people who actually have left their own comfort zones and have sort of transpose themselves into a new environment where they basically are trying to navigate all these new challenges for a host of reasons. And so that became very, very wired. The second thing is, you mentioned about the ability to communicate yourself. Coming to this country, because I had a heavy accent, my father was very clear with me in saying, look, we have St. Lucia, most people don't know what St. Lucia is, but we have more Nobel laureates per capita than anywhere else in the world. So we kind of held that. We only like 100,000 people, but we have 2 Nobel laureates. We'll take that. So by definition, we have, right? So Arthur Lewis in 79 for economics and Derek Walcott in 1980. So we'll take that. But what that helped me understand was, look, people make fun of you because of the accent that you may have as a child, but you belong. You're curious. So you have to learn how to communicate your ideas and your thoughts. So I grew up in a house with limited television, lots of books. And so my father had me engaged at an early age where I was we were debating different things, whether it's the extinction of dinosaurs or literally, all sorts of issues around the world, even back then, Golan Heights, Gaza Strip, West Bank, like we were active discourse late at night as a 7 and 8-year-old child, or even about the stock market. So I was versed in trying to defend my thinking and defending my ideas, which, by the way, is living in a house of constant inquiry, which again, I think is the most critical thing. And talk about leadership, by the way, the one thing I'd say here is that I learned this way too late. It only occurred to me a few years ago. I thought that being a leader was having the answers to questions. It's actually wrong. I've realized that the key for being an effective leader, to the extent to which one could ever claim to be, is learning the right questions to ask. And so I made that inversion several years ago. It's changed everything for me. Like listening carefully what people are saying and saying, that's interesting. Did we think about doing it this way? Or why? That's an interesting approach. Why are you taking this approach versus that approach? It invites people in. They are able to contribute at a higher level. It changes how you recruit people too. Fundamentally, who you bring into that circle of honest inquiry, stripping away the ego, and trying to get to the truth is a very, very important orientation. And by the way, the field of work that we're doing here, since it's in the knowledge economy, where most of the work that's being done it's done in a black box. You can tell when someone, if you work in a restaurant, if someone's making the dishes properly, or they're doing the right level of customer service, they work in Banana Republic, or whatever it may be, if they're a doctor. You can't see the quality of code that someone's writing. You have to trust. And by the time you decide there's an issue, it's typically too late. So it requires bringing in people who are self-aware, that are comfortable being vulnerable, which is, again, in a lot of communities, is the opposite of what's being taught. You always have to be right. If you're wrong, you're going to get fired. We have to sort of rewire these things. You've got to create space for people to make mistakes. You have to, and that begins with a leader, capital L, being very proactive in communicating when they have made mistakes. I actively mention that to my staff. I'll say things, wait, Terraform, I don't know what could you explain to me what that is? And they see that you're in a space of actively learning. It changes the contours of the company.
It sure does. It sure does. And there's so much to unpack there. We are going to have to transition in a moment, but I do want to reiterate, I love the idea. You might have used slightly different language, but having a mindset of both growth and possibility. Oftentimes I think people get pigeonholed into what they perceive as their limitations. So whether that's an economic limitation, a limitation based on being a child of immigrants, or a limitation based on where they live, or any other variable at play, what's fascinating to me, and you're a great example of that, is that there's so much opportunity, there's so much possibility if you are willing to go beyond what you perceive to be your immediate box, to be inquisitive, to be willing to learn, to ask the right questions, and then, of course, to take steps necessary to become better than where you are today. And I think that for whatever the reason, culturally and otherwise, we really don't have as much of that today as I would love to see. And I certainly the kind of thing that I definitely push within my own, whether it's a mastermind group that I run or the coaching that I do, helping clients, and of course, speaking to myself as well. How can I become better? How can I learn more? trying to put my ego to the side as much as possible. None of us are perfect in that regard. Being willing to do that, or at least have the mindset so that you can continue to push yourself forward, because the world is really looking for, there's no shortage of opportunity for good people. There's no shortage of opportunity for people who are willing to sharpen their skills and work hard. It's just a question of, are you from that frame of mind? And so I'd love to talk about it more. I'm sure you have a response that would take us, even deeper and more fascinating. But I'm just going to end this segment, Sheldon, with the question of, with all the successes and all the great things that you've described so far, what would you say was the biggest mistake you've made along your personal and or professional journey thus far? And how has that propelled you for continued growth or for the next step?
Yeah. I mean, the question is, where does one begin? But there's something that certainly jumps out. I think that one of the things that I've learned, and it has turned out to become true as I played out over and over again, I think it's very tempting when you have a new idea and you're looking to bring people on to help you move this thing up this mountain, where we don't want to go at it alone. And we really want to find partners, and we really want to find people to actually help us do the work. And I've seen this play out multiple times, and this has become an axiom for me at this point. And I tell my team all the time, no hire is always better than a bad hire. No hire is always, in your rush to try and do this thing, if you bring in the wrong person, they can poison the well so extensively that it takes, and when they poison that well, even when you move that person out, you're gonna have to move like 2 or 3 other people out too. And then that sets you back by 2 years. And so it's really important that you have to be very protective of the environment that you're creating, and you will get along farther. You have to be very judicious about who you bring in, and so that sort of not making that hire actually allows you to go much farther than you think. It seems very tempting. People will tell you all the time, listen, we've got all these customers, we got to just hire people. Like, no, you'd be surprised. And that's the one thing, it sounds counterintuitive. And that's one of the things I would also say too, to your last part about, one of the things I've actually started to do a lot is I do a lot of what's called inverted thinking. I spend a lot of time sort of thinking something in saying, like, well, how do we flip this the other way? Like, again, it sounds counterintuitive. Why would we not hire this person? We have all these customers trying to rush in. If you bring in the wrong person under the circumstance and the processes break, you may never get those customers back next week when the food wasn't cooked properly, things like that. Right?
Got it. Okay. So with that, that's great. Yeah, I agree. It is counterintuitive. We want to certainly bring in people to be properly staffed, but we need the right people. And the wrong people are trouble. There's no question.
And it costs you a lot more. It sets you back.
Costs you a lot more. There's no question about it. Yeah. So let's now transition to rapid fire, where the answers are short and sweet. First one, your favorite movie.
Cinema Paradiso.
Okay. A famous person, living or deceased, who you'd like to speak with or do lunch with.
Jane Goodall.
Nice. 2 tips to staying fit physically and or mentally.
Get a trainer to stay fit, to make sure you have the right form and make sure you stay on course. And mentally, I would also say similar, like I think having a mental coach or therapist is invaluable. Psychotherapy.
The coolest thing for you about living in New York City.
The ability to experience just about anything that I want to within 5 subway stops away.
If you could share a message with the entire world, it would be?
That when you're being kind to other people, you receive more than you actually are giving.
Nice. Finally, a productivity tip that helps you to get more done, Sheldon.
My go-to right now is using ChatGPT. I begin there first. Even though when I know how to do something, I first go to ChatGPT to stress test my thinking.
Interesting. How can people connect with you and learn more about your work?
you could reach me on LinkedIn. You look up Sheldon Gilbert. There are several Sheldon Gilberts out there, but look for the one who's from St. Lucia. No. You could also
The best, look for the best looking one out there.
Thank you for that. I'll send you Bitcoin later for that. Thank you, brother.
Okay.
And then also Sheldon at Kura Labs, KURALABS.org. Sheldon at KuraLabs.org.
Wow. Okay. And finally, Sheldon, like I said, so much to unpack, so much wisdom. I'm trying to just process it all. And as I shared with you before, making a wedding for my son on just a few nights. So my head is exploding with all sorts of goodness, all sorts of goodness. Right. Leave us, please, with one final life lesson to end this episode.
Final life lesson to end the episode. I firmly believe, and it's been my lived experience, is that I really believe that we're the captains of we're the architects of our own destiny. I believe wholeheartedly in self-agency. And it's funny, a lot of people, I think they have all these constraints. Capital, we don't have the money. Most of the things I've started, I didn't have any capital. I built it and the capital start to come. So don't be constrained. Don't limit your thinking. Don't limit, you could activate.
Awesome. Well, I've learned a ton. Not only the technological stuff, which you could geek out on it. I'm not sure I could so well, but certainly on the leadership side, the self-development, what's possible for all of us as individuals and part of the broader fabric, if you will, of humanity. So thank you, Sheldon, for the inspiration, for the insights. I cannot wait to share this conversation with my audience. And I certainly look forward, as a former Manhattanite, one to the other, I certainly look forward to continuing the conversation and hopefully getting to know you better offline as well.
That's right. And again, thank you so much, Naftali, for having me, and mazel tov to you and your family and your son's wedding.
Amen, as we say.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye now.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode and for investing in yourself so that you can lead to succeed. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the show. Your feedback gives the show more social proof and encourages more folks to listen.